Yes.
Okay.
Evening. We have been talking about the authorship of the book of Genesis and of, in fact, the Torah itself, the 5 books, so-called, of Moses, which since the middle of the 19th century,
All my hats are downstairs.
are believed to be written by a number of authors. There are many theories. And we've talked about the documentary hypothesis as one that would enable us to understand the origins of this text. And you're therefore prepared to understand that the first creation story, and there are several in the Bible, the first creation story of the 6-day creation, which we'll read tonight in a very interesting and beautiful translation by Professor Alter, which Bernie Bannett, who was a student in this class, I believe, sent to me, all 3 volumes of his translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is a brilliant undertaking, as you would imagine, and an enormous undertaking. But he did it, and he wrote it very beautifully. And despite the fact that we're dealing with a composite text of 4 to 40 authors, I would say so many authors, it's also true that it is arranged finally by the editor, who may be Ezra, we don't know, but somebody maybe around 400 or 350 BCE, put all this together. And he divided it between primordial tales and patriarchal tales. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are not about Israelites. Oh, and speaking of Israelites, I wish you all a happy Hanukkah. You can see the menorah is lighted behind me. This is the second night. And the first night we light 1 candle, and then it goes to 8 candles, finally, the light of God spreading and spreading. I remind those who aren't familiar with Hanukkah that it celebrates the first victory ever won for religious freedom, when the Syrian emperor, who controlled the Middle East in 175 BC, came to power, and about a few years later, he declared himself to be Zeus, the king of the gods, and all his followers had to worship him. Well, of course, the Jews couldn't do that. They said, we will pray for the emperor in our temples, but we will not pray to him. Well, he was a paranoid leader, as some others that we know have been, and he had a statue of himself. I feel like saying put it on a playing card, but he had a statue of himself made in the garb of Zeus, and it was brought into the temple courtyard and set up. It was called, the Jews said it was the abomination of desolation, and they went to war. And the war lasted a number of years, but for a variety of reasons, the Jews actually won the war. What began as a ragtag army of farmers turned into quite a force and held off the Syrian hordes, professional armies, 3 times. And the result was the Syrians said, oh, the hell with this, so they walked away. And Judah, or Judea as it was called, became an independent nation for about 100 years. So it was a successful war for freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. That's one reason why it is celebrated with more fanfare in America than among Jews and perhaps other countries. It's a minor holiday because it's not mentioned in the Bible. The book of Maccabees 1 and 2 tell the story of this uprising, but those 2 books never got into the Bible. And so we have to look outside to these very exciting books to tell us the story of how Judah Maccabee or Judas Maccabeus, who's a great military leader, led his people in this great victory for freedom of religion. And so in America, it has special resonance. And it is celebrated. The children get presents every night. And hopefully parents tell them this is about religious freedom and how important it is and how sometimes you have to go to fight for it. So it's a marvelous holiday. And in my home, we celebrated Christmas and Easter. My mother just liked holidays, and she wasn't going to leave one holiday uncelebrated. So I, a greedy child, got presents every night for Hanukkah. And when I didn't get from Hanukkah, I put on my list for Santa Claus. And I got it Christmas morning. So ruined my character, you know. I got whatever I wanted as a child. Destroyed me. I became a wastrel. In any case, I celebrate both holidays. And last night had a ceremony to light my Hanukkah candles. The first night of Hanukkah was also the night of the fourth Sunday of Advent. And so I went to Grace Church there, a magnificent performance of carols and lessons from the Bible, and just beautiful service. And then this Friday night, I'll be going to the Hanukkah service at KKBE Temple. So I see no reason why not to embrace both. That's my philosophy. It has to do with Judaism and Christianity, in my opinion, essentially giving us a message which is compatible, if not identical, and that we should join hands and do what God put us here to do, build a better world instead of arguing with each other over who's right or who's wrong. All right, that's my little Hanukkah excursus, and now we come back to what I was talking about. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are universal history. Noah and all these people were not Jewish. They were the parents, the ancestors of all of us, according to this tale. And that's the first 11 chapters. But then suddenly, chapter 12, an abrupt break. And the Lord said to Abram, Lech lecha me'artzecha mi'beit avicha. It's poetry in Hebrew. Get thee forth from thy land and from the house of thy father, and I will take you to a land which will be yours, and you will be great. And in you shall all the peoples of the world be blessed. So that's the call of Abraham. And now we're going to focus not on the world population, but on one man. And from him, a family will be built. By miracle, he'll have a child at 100 years old and his wife 90. A miracle child. We celebrate another miracle child at this season. This idea of an ancient woman who couldn't possibly bear a child having one, or a virgin having one. With God, all things are possible. That's what these legends are telling us. Whether you take them literally or metaphorically, that's the message. As the old black hymn says, God can make a way out of no way for you. Your back is against the sea. Your enemies are coming down on you in chariots, and suddenly the sea opens and you march through. All of us who have had terrible experiences in life of loss and hurt have had that experience, or else we wouldn't be here. The Red Sea opens for us. And we thought a moment ago we couldn't go on. It was too terrible. The pain was too great. You realize you have to. As I said the other week, the Psalm says not to settle in the valley of death, but to walk through it and to keep going. And that's what we all have to do. And that's what all these stories are about. You might say that the book of Genesis and the creation itself The world we live in is a divine experiment. God creates us with free will. And there's the rub. What are we going to do with the free will? God cannot interfere with it, or else it's not truly free will. So he leaves us to our own devices. He tells us what to do and then departs. He watches, he's involved, but he doesn't interfere with the free will. If he did, we'd be robots and there'd be no point to the creation. But what is the point to the creation? It's to use our free will to do his will, to make a better world, to build the kingdom of God in the human community. That's what we're here for. That's our job. We're the hands of God here. But we misuse that human free will. That's what the Adam and Eve story is all about. That's how evil got into the world. But before we get to the Adam and Eve story, which is about everybody, just not about Jews and Christians. There were no Jews and Christians then. We have an introduction to the whole thing, which is the 6-day creation story. But we're going to start that in a minute and just read it because it's so beautiful, and then go back and analyze each day and perhaps compare it to pagan myths at the same time also had the gods creating a world step by step, beginning with air, water, then land, things getting more solid, then conflicts of good and evil, as you have in the Garden of Eden story. But in the 6-day creation story, there is no hint of evil or sin or flaw. Everything is good. It's in the Adam and Eve story, written by a different author. He had a very different take on creation, perhaps more cynical or less positive. And we'll see how that story contrasts with the 6-day story. So we have 2 creation stories here. Back to the idea that this is a divine experiment. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. God says you can eat of every tree except that one tree. You've got 1,000 trees here. Don't eat of that tree. And they eat of it. So they misuse their human free will. They try to be the deciders of good and evil. That's not our job, says the Bible. You can disagree or agree with that, but that's what it's saying. It's God's job. It's our job to carry out what he says is good and evil, not to try to define it ourselves. But they try to define it themselves, and God is disappointed and has to get them out of the Garden of Eden before they eat of the tree of eternal life, because now that they set themselves against him, he can't afford to have them be immortal beings as they were supposed to be. They'll be rival gods. So they've got to go out of the Garden of Eden. They've been a big disappointment. Then they have 2 children, Cain and Abel. Another chance to do God's will. Both Cain and Abel bring offerings to God. And for reasons we will discuss, God accepts the sacrifice of Abel and rejects the sacrifice of his brother Cain. And Cain is furious. And God says, just look what your brother did. Why don't you act that way? Well, if that's, maybe God is these are his first children. You don't say that, act like your brother. That's fatal. Dr. Spock could tell you that. The baby doctor. Well, God says that. So Cain gets even more infuriated and murders his brother. Murders him. Misuses his free will. God said you have free will. Emulate your brother. Instead, he kills him. The second disappointment. Then you have the people who build the Tower of Babel. Then and Noah, an unprecedentedly evil generation. And things, God chooses in each of these generations a man to make a choice. And if he will only make the right choice. But Adam makes the wrong choice, and Cain makes the wrong choice, and Noah makes the wrong choice. He's very good during the flood, but then afterwards gets involved with some terrible incestuous sin. He fails. The Tower of Babel people fail, who think they can build a tower up to God and take heaven by storm. They all fail. And so in chapter 12, he starts again. And God must be thinking, Adam failed, Cain failed, Noah failed. Abraham must not fail. I'm going to take one man and from him create a family, and from that family a tribe, and from that tribe a people, and they will be my hands on earth. They will be my son on earth. Remember when Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go, he says, let Israel go. Israel is God's firstborn son. The son of God in the Hebrew scriptures is the people Israel. The son of God in the Christian scriptures is a single Israelite. But they're both here to redeem the world, to bring the world to God and to its proper function of serving God. And that's why I see such parallels. Judaism and Christianity aim at the same thing. One focuses on the life of an individual. What I heard at the Advent service Sunday night was the whole story of Jesus' life. Magnificent, and placed in the context of the Christian idea of fall and redemption. In Adam we fall, in Christ, the second Adam, we rise again to eternal life with God, an intimate life with God. In the Jewish understanding, in Adam, we don't fall in the sense of everything becomes corrupted, but we will learn to misuse our free will. And the way to get back into God's, in a close relationship with God, is the Torah, which we call the eighth stone, the tree of life. So we lost the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, we gain it in the Torah. Christians lose the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, they gain it in the cross, which is even called a tree in the Gospel of Luke. Loss and regaining, fall and rise. That's what life is about, what the human story is about. And with this scripture that God has given us, according to this story, we are to guide ourselves to do back to being who we should be, the hands of God on earth. So first we have the patriarchal stories, chapters 1 through 11. I'm sorry, the primeval mythic stories, shrouded in the clouds of ancient fable and myth. And then you get to Abraham. If such a character existed, he would have been around 1800 BC. And we go forward from chapter 12 to chapter whatever it is, 50 at the end of Genesis, all about the patriarchs, the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Marvelous stories, immortal stories. And that's why we're still reading them. We can still learn from them, and they're just so very beautiful to read. These religions are the acting out of stories. If you go to a liturgical church like the Episcopal Church, you will see that every week they act out the story. They talk about the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, and then the redemption that comes through Christ. And they say it over and over and over. And you go to a synagogue, and what do we talk about? The history of the people Israel. And we say it over and over and over, because that history is the guide to how human beings should live, just as the life of Jesus is the guide to how human beings should live. So we miss the parallel because in the Hebrew scriptures, the Son of God is a collective individual, Israel, and in the Christian scriptures, a single individual, Jesus. At least that's the way I see it. Now, with that understanding, again, we have to look at the very beginning. The dilemma of history is not articulated until the second story, which is the Adam and Eve story, written actually hundreds of years before the six-day creation story. And when the whole thing was edited, probably during the Babylonian exile or a little later, the stories were put together, but in fact, they tell very different tales of what the world is about. It's not just what happened a billion years ago or whenever this is supposed to have happened, but about how it is now. Are people basically good or evil? What is the nature of freedom? What is determined in life? And what can be altered by freedom? But there is a third element, chance. You have determinism. I mean, I didn't choose to be born a male rather than a female, an American rather than an Englishman, a Jew rather than a Christian. Now you can change all of that, by the way, and you can even change your gender now. But in those days, these were things which were determined. Can't do anything about it. But within it, you have free will. And that makes all the difference. And you add the free will to the determinism, and maybe we have 1 foot in one and 1 foot in the others. But then chance steps in, which nobody could predict, and makes life a very interesting proposition. And it can sometimes be very tragic or very wonderful. I was just saying to someone the other day, I applied to 3 colleges many years ago, and I didn't realize that they had a very small quota for Jews. And there was no way I was going to get in there. And I was left in April of my senior year with no college. And I talked to the college advisor, who should have warned me about this situation, but was not very competent. And I said, are there any colleges available in April that I can go to? He said, yes. University of Wisconsin and Syracuse University are both taking students. Well, I figured on Syracuse, it's closer to New York, not really realizing it was the snow capital of the universe. But I applied with heavy heart to Syracuse University, believing it to be quite a second-rate place. That's what I had heard, where people have fraternities and parties and waste their time. So I went up, and I got in. I went up there, dejected and depressed. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. I found myself there. I found great professors. I learned there was something called philosophy and something called theology. And you could study the Bible with great minds. And I was hooked. I discovered who I was. And I fought against it. Was it chance? Or was it God stepping in and throwing in a little bit of determinism we didn't know about? Who knows? But it certainly wasn't my choice. And everything I became afterwards, I thank that great university and its philosophy department and its religion department for. Amazing. And of course, there were some extraordinary people like the poet Delmore Schwartz and others teaching in the English department. And I was exposed to James Joyce and all. So it was wonderful. So chance. The Bible doesn't really take chance very seriously. But perhaps the first lines of the Bible suggest it. Depends on how you translate it. So, with all of this introduction, I just want to read from the translation that was sent to me recently and it impresses me very much by Professor Alter. And see if you like it as we go along. It's not exactly what you have before you, but as you read what you have, the Revised Standard or whatever what I usually use, compare this in your head, see if you like it. I'm going to have to turn this light on to read it. Book of Genesis, chapter 1. And I will explain after reading through why the translation here is a little different from what you have. But a little difference that in the first line makes a tremendous difference. Chapter 1. When God began to create heaven and earth, there was the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. It was evening, and it was morning, first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide water from water." And God made the vault, and it divided the water beneath the vault from the water above the vault. And so it was. And God called the vault heavens, and it was evening, and it was morning, second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, so that the dry land will appear." And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth grow grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit of each kind that has its seed within it upon the earth." And so it was. And the earth put forth grass, plants yielding seed, and trees bearing fruit of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to divide the day from the night. And they shall be signs for the fixed times and for days and years. And they shall be lights in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth." And so it was. And God made the two great lights, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. And God placed them in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth and to have dominion over day and night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, fourth day. God said, "Let the waters swarm with the swarm of living creatures, and let fowl fly over the earth across the vault of the heavens." And God created the great sea monsters and every creature that crawls, which the water has swarmed forth of each kind, and the winged fowl of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And it was evening, and it was morning, fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of each kind, cattle and crawling things, and wild beasts of each kind. And so it was. And God made wild beasts of each kind, and cattle of every kind, and crawling things on the ground of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make a human in our image, in our likeness, to hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and the cattle, and the wild beasts, and all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth. So God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and conquer it, and hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and every beast that crawls upon the earth. And God said, look around you. I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of all the earth, and every tree that is fruit-bearing seed. Yours they will be for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and to all the fowl of the heavens, and to all that crawls upon the earth, which has the breath of life within it, the green plants are given for food. And so it was. And God saw all that he had done, and look, it was very good. And it was evening, and it was morning, a sixth day. Then the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their array. And God completed on the seventh day the task he had done. And he ceased on the seventh day from all the task he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, for on it he had ceased from all his tasks that he had created to do. This then is the story of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Well, no wonder we're still reading this. It's such a beautiful tale and takes its place among the great myths of creation, many of which, as I said, are in stages, day 1, day 2, day 3. Now, of course, we're not dealing with days in a literal sense. It means a phase, a period. Since the sun wasn't created until several days into the creation, we can't be talking about 24-hour days, even as they understood the sun and the moon. So a day could be 25 hours, or 26, or 26 million years. This story does not conflict in any way with the timetable of science, because a day, of course, is not to be taken literally. There are some people who insist that it is. But as the example I use is, if I were writing a story about George Washington, I would say in the day of our first president, men wore powdered wigs. Does that mean Washington lived under only one day? I mean, come on. It means during the period in which he lived. So God creates the world in 6 periods. Is it arbitrary? Well, I suppose it's the fruit of the imagination of the writer, but he sees the world becoming more and more complex. And of course, the crown of creation, that's us. And he creates us in his image. We'll get to that a little later. Maybe that's the most important line in the Bible, that we are in the image and likeness of God. The prophets denounced paganism. I think they gave paganism a bad rap. It was really nature worship. But they saw people worshiping idols of stone and of wood. And one prophet had a great insight. They have eyes, but they see not, the statue. They have noses, they inhale not. They have mouths, and they speak not. Them that make them shall be like unto them. We fashion a God, and we become like that God. He is our exemplar. Personally, that's what Jesus is for me, a great exemplar. I'm a Jew, not a Christian. I don't view Jesus as a Messiah for a variety of complicated reasons. But I think he was a man that we should try to live up to, really one among the greats. And God himself personifies all of our good qualities. And so them that make him become like unto him. How do we make God? Well, God is God. When Moses says to God, "What's your name?" He says, "I shall be what I shall be," or "I am that I am." In other words, stand back, buddy. It's none of your business, and you couldn't possibly comprehend what I am. So we start with adjectives. God is kind, God is good, God is long-suffering, God is patient, God is just. He's just. He's no pushover. But he represents the best in the human, blown up to gigantic scale. And there we have our God. And now we act, hopefully, in imitation of him. Them that have a God will become like unto them. If we worship stone and wood, we become hard like stone and wood. If we worship a compassionate God, we're ready to forgive and to look past what people do or say to the heart of the person, because that person is created in the image of God, however obnoxious that person may be. Down deep in him, in her, as in you, is that place which is the reflection of God. Will we live up to it? Or will we be distracted by petty anger and dislikes? There was someone the other night, Friday night at the temple, at the reception afterwards, and he and I have had some strong disagreements over a particular issue, and we didn't say hello to each other. I should have. We can disagree without being disagreeable, as somebody once said. Next time I see him, I'll make a point of saying hello. But one doesn't, I mean, I teach this stuff, but I don't live up to it. So there we are. Ego comes in, and like Adam, makes us want to be God and decide what's right and wrong. We know very well. All right. Let's begin analyzing what we've just read. I wanted to read it through because Alter's translation is especially beautiful and it's very moving. And now we can analyze it. First of all, the very first sentence is a source of great disagreement. Hebrew is a very vague language. It is a series of consonants. And the verb sounds were not put in, the vowel pointing, I mean, was not put in till years later. So all you have, say, is a letter that looks like this, and it's pronounced R. But it's unpronounceable unless you put a little dot or a dash underneath. If you want to say re, you put one dot underneath, and then it's re. If you want to say re, you put three dots like that in a triangle underneath, and it's re. You want to say ray, dot, dot next to each other, ray. You want to say raw, you put a T under it. That's the aw sound. Ah, just a line, horizontal line, and it's raw. It's very easy to read Hebrew. It's totally phonetical. but you sort of read it like this: consonant and the vowel, and then the consonant and the vowel. But I mean, when you get used to it, you just rush through it. But it's the vowel signs that were put in later that we're talking about. If you say Bereshit, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created, Elohim, God. So we know this is a P text, a priestly text. He doesn't say Lord. He doesn't call God by his own proper name, which you get in the second story, in the Garden of Eden story, different author. And when the word Lord appears, you've got a more intimate story, as in the Garden of Eden story, where they actually walk and talk with God in the garden. Here, this is a more cosmic and distant story. Human beings don't come in until the last day. That's similar to Babylonian creation stories, which are all about gods. And at the very last minute, human beings are created. And they're created to be servants of the gods, not in any moral sense, but just to do work. And they are created out of the blood of Kingu, who is a god of chaos. So you're not going to expect very much of human beings. And indeed, they turn out to be pretty rotten. Original sin.
There it is.
Oh, here we are with original sin. Oh my gosh. Now see, Roman Catholics, that's their whole principle is.
I'm going to turn off your microphone, please.
Somebody,
You're meditating on original sin, but everybody can hear you.
Oh, she wants to talk about original.
Thank you. Original sin didn't just pop up in the mind of St. Paul. People have been putting it in their creation myths since time immemorial, before the Israelites came along. The Israelites chose not to do that. Nobody is born evil. Everything's good. Even in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve start off good, even though they mess up. But that idea that there was some mistake made in the beginning, it's not so crazy. Look at human history. You could conclude there's something wrong with human beings, or else you wouldn't have this history of misery and war and hatred and the Putins of the world and the others. And yet there's something very right with human beings. Look at all the wonderful people who live in the world. Look at how the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom. So are people basically good or bad? This is a question so complicated that no story, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, can possibly answer it. But we try to get at some level of accuracy. And we succeed a little bit. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. If you read it with certain vowel signs, that's how to translate it. God created the heaven and the earth, period. But then the earth was a formless chaos. He says, welter and waste, tohu vavohu in Hebrew. How could God create a world that then was, after he created it, a formless chaos? And so people began to look at this ancient translation in English, not ancient, but King James, and certain Bibles before, and say, wait a minute, you can read the Hebrew by repointing the text. You can read it when God began the creation of the heaven and the earth was already a formless chaos. Now, in a way, that makes more sense. But here's the problem, if it's a problem. Every ancient myth that I have studied believed that the gods were eternal, but also matter was eternal. Pure matter. Now, none of us has ever seen matter. Even mud is matter formed according to the idea of mud. Matter is just the stuff out of which everything is created. In the Greek notion of creation. God creates from this mushmash, which we see here as tohu vavohu, waste and void. From this mushmash, he creates earth. And all solid things will be made out of earth in one way or another. And he creates water. And all liquid things are basically water. And he creates air. All gaseous things will come from the air. And he creates fire, which is the symbol of the dynamic interaction of earth, air, fire, and water. But the matter out of which he created earth, air, and fire, and water was always here. So what is eternal? The God and unformed matter. Therefore, what the God has to do, or the gods working together, depending on the myth you're reading, is to form the matter gradually into something coherent. That's why you have these stages of creation so often, as we have before us here. So rather than creating something from nothing, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth from what? Nothing. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. If the ancient Israelite writer who wrote this believed that, he was totally alone among ancient myth writers. They all thought that there was eternal matter and then God ordered the matter. And have an image in your mind. Everybody has this image. Whether your grandmother ever did this or not, everyone has the image of grandma in the kitchen rolling out the dough. Take that to be the matter. And then she has metal shapes, a star or a crescent, and she stamps it and picks up and then bakes, and that's the cookie in this or that shape. She is imposing form on matter. So that you run into the kitchen and she'll say, well, what is this? She'll say, it's a star. And what is this? It's a crescent moon. Isn't that exciting? When it cools down, you can eat it. It's not just a mush of dough. So the people who proposed the translation before me, when God began to create the heaven and the earth was already a formless chaos, point to the creation, not as creation of something from nothing, but as the creation of order from chaos. God took all this mushmash and he imposed order on it. And we do the same thing. I don't want to get into philosophy of mind here, but when Wordsworth talked about the world we have, perceive, and have create. In perceiving the world as made up of particular objects, we are in a sense creating it, like God. But this is now the most popular translation among modern translators. And it makes more sense unless, suppose we were to stick with the old translation. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth that he had just created was a formless mess, a mushmash. Does that reflect the fact in our life? Because the question is not what happened back then, because who knows? The question is, what resonates with us today? If we live in God's world, and religious people believe he created this world, however, you still have free will to mess things up and chance. Tohu vavohu, mush and mosh. There's a lot of mushmash out here. And purposes don't always have the consequences we want. Often they don't. And there's side consequences and all kinds of things we don't anticipate. So maybe there's some truth to this old translation, that the world that God created still has this element of chaos in it, which we might call chance. And you could make a philosophy out of that. But then what did the writer mean, if we can dare to ask that question? Probably meant what the new translations are talking about. There was eternal matter kind of mush out there. There was God, and God decided to take that mushmash and to put it into order and to create life, because without order there cannot be life. And what is order? Order is distinctions between water and earth, between air and water, between light and dark, between night and day, between good and evil. It's a whole world of distinctions. And now we know how to function in that world. We've got rules and regulations. We knew how to function in our country until recent politicians have just acted as if the rules and the fences didn't exist. And suddenly we're shaken, the republic is shaken, and there's an insurrection. And people do things that nobody ever thought of doing. It's a very dangerous time. We have to have, it's not just our Constitution, but we have to have people to say, these are the rules in which we function, and we can't just throw it out if we don't like it, because without it, we have chaos. And people fear that more than anything in the world. So we'll find our legs again. But let's take a look at how order emerges out of chaos. Once assume that Alter's translation is correct, and it reflects many others in the last 100 years. When God began to create the heaven and the earth out of some kind of undifferentiated matter, it was a chaos, and now he had to bring order. And how did he do it? He did it, for some reason, in 6 phases. Why? That's not for God, that's for us, so we can understand how things are starting with mush and ending up more and more defined. Day 1, let there be light. Without light, you can't do anything. And there was light. No sooner said than done. That's God. He said, let there be light. There's light. And then it says, no, right before that, let's look at this sentence. Everything was a welter and waste and darkness over the deep. Now the deep, this just doesn't mean an ocean. There are no oceans yet. The word in Hebrew here is tahom, T-A-H-O-M. That is a Hebrew equivalent of Tiamat. Tiamat figures in an earlier creation legend, going back at least to 2000 BC. It's the Babylonian creation legend. And after the world is created in a number of days, Marduk, the great hero of the gods, is created. He's the god of gods, sometimes identified as the sun god. And you can understand that in the Middle East, where the sun is everything. Marduk is the hero of the gods, but there is a goddess, a villain, and the villain often is feminine, ladies, because men write the stories. The goddess of chaos is named Tiamat. Marduk represents order, not moral order as we understand it today, good and bad, and be kind and compassionate, but just order rather than chaos. Order without which no society can function and no human life can be lived. There are rules. Marduk represents order and Tiamat represents chaos. And on some level, every ancient myth, including in the Bible stories, is telling the same story, how order triumphs over chaos. And it must, or else we fall into the abyss of nothingness. In this story, Marduk, we have a picture of him as this magnificent superhuman being, no, God, who looks like a human being, but it's a God. There are no human beings yet. And then he takes on Tiamat in single combat. She takes the form of a dragon, the snake in the Garden of Eden. Reptiles often in Western literature are evil. In Eastern literature, they have great wisdom, but the Bible is Western. And the other myth I'm talking about, Western Babylonian. And Tiamat takes on the form of a dragon. She's described as in a state of hysteria, and because without order. And Marduk comes with his spear and his net. And after quite a conflict, he ensnares her in the net. She opens her mouth to devour him. He takes his bow and arrow and zap, it goes right into her mouth, cuts her in half. And he makes a vault out of part of her body. And that is where the rain comes from. She represents the watery abyss. Water in an ordered way, when it comes out of our faucet, gives us life. Water, when we have a flood, a hurricane, or whatever, brings death. So what you need is ordered water. So what Marduk does is take Tiamat, this dragon who represented the watery abyss, and he takes half of her and arches her across the heavens. And that's where rain comes from. And the other half, he makes the oceans. And then he establishes the dry land and builds his house there. So Tiamat is still there, lurking and waiting to bring chaos when we have a hurricane, when we have a storm surge. Tiamat is striking back against order. But order always prevails. Even the worst hurricane ends. And we survive it, and we rebuild. That's Marduk. So these stories are true, not because these gods lived, or didn't live, or however they're supposed to have existed, but because they personify the principle of order and chaos in our own lives. And we're constantly fighting it. You're going along perfectly well, and your brother dies. And you walk through the valley of death. You're going along perfectly well, you lose your job, and you can't provide for your family. You've got to find a job, and you're desperate, but ultimately you find it. So order versus chaos. Chaos is always threatening. But order, we're told in these stories, will always prevail. And so it has, because the human being, the human life, the human civilization has continued despite Nazis and communists and all kinds of horrible people. Order prevails. Now, in the Bible, you're going to have a similar story, but in the Garden of Eden story, but in this 6-day story, here's Tiamat making her appearance. And it says, darkness over the Tehom, the watery abyss of chaos. And so it's not the ocean, it's something primeval and primordial and terrifying. But it doesn't fight God. In the Tiamat Marduk myth, Tiamat, chaos, fights order, and they fight it out. But here, Tiamat is subdued. She's not personified. She's just lying there. Because God is all powerful in this 6-day story. Nobody opposes him. Nothing opposes him. He's the one power. He's just doing everything. He's like playing with his Tinker Toys or whatever. And he's building a world with Legos. I mean, it's a marvel. When you look at it, it's a divine experiment. It's quite charming. He's seeing what he can do. And so are we. So on the first day, there are many interesting things. You have the ghost of Tiamat appearing and the word deep. And then the next sentence, Alter says, God's breath hovering over the waters. Your translation probably says, and the Spirit of God moving over the waters. Now that's either one. Remember, breath, he's translating Ruach, Elohim is the breath of God. All right. The words for spirit / breath and wind are the same word in Hebrew. It says the Ruach Elohim was above the watery abyss. Now, look how differently you can translate that. If I say the Spirit of God is hovering lovingly over the world, that's very comforting. But Ruach Elohim can also be translated, a wind from God was sweeping o'er the watery abyss. There's no comfort there. You remember those movies you see with dinosaurs in halfway submerged in water. This is a terrifying prospect. I wouldn't want to be projected back there, despite those silly movies. This was a world which is just emerging out of chaos, terrifying. So to say Ruach Elohim is the wind of God sweeping over the chaotic abyss, pretty negative. But if you say the Spirit of God hovering over, or even more so, the breath of God, because Ruach can be translated like that, the breath of God, the creative breath of God, because the word creates. In many ancient myths, the god has intercourse with a goddess and creates that way. We're familiar with that kind of creation. But in the Bible, he creates by the word. Very different, because the Bible's authors were very wary of the sex cults all around them. The cultists in Judah and Israel, when Israel got there under Joshua in Canaan, was the sex cult of Baal and Ashtarte, who were god and goddess in heaven, and every spring they would come together, have intercourse, and then the world would come back to life. So, excuse me, how could you be sure that Baal and Ashtarte would do their thing in the spring? You go to an enormous sex orgy where everybody has sex with everybody else. This is known as sympathetic magic. You do on earth what you want the gods in heaven to do. When the American Indian does a rain dance, at some point he pours out water. You get it, Great Spirit? We want lots of water. If you have a sex orgy, you get it, Ashtarte and Baal, don't forget. You've got to have intercourse, and so the world will be reborn in the spring. And it always worked. Can't argue with that. Nobody fell asleep in church in those days. They were too busy. Well, the Jews were horrified by this. And they wanted to make sure in the very beginning of their creation story that there wasn't any sex. It was done by the word. Think about the history of the Jews. The great contribution of the Jews is the word. First of all, the Bible. And there have been great Jewish musicians and great Jewish painters. But the word is the Jewish legacy to the world. The Bible, and you will find that even in America, where Jews can do anything they want to do, they go to places that are centered on words, become lawyers. Or television is full of Jewish commentators talking and talking and talking. Newspapers full of Jewish columnists. The word, Hollywood, created by Jews. The great art form of the 20th century, the movie, and a Jewish invention. Words, words, words. And things haven't changed in all those years. That's where I'm most comfortable, talking. And I found a profession where they actually paid me a little to do it. And I was delighted. Words. So words are tremendously important here. And every line can be read differently. And I don't know whether he meant the Spirit of God hovering lovingly over the water, or a wind of God rushing terrifyingly over the water. I don't know what was in his mind, but Hebrew is so vague that it can mean either one and set two totally different moods. Well, the Alter translation chooses a very benevolent one. And you have God's breath hovering over the waters. All right. That's one possible way, a very benevolent way of looking at this. And God says, let there be light, the word. And there was light. And God saw the light and it was good. Everything is given a moral value. In the Cheyenne Indian creation story, which is also a creation in a series of days, at the end of each day, the Great Spirit says how beautiful it is. And those Indians loved nature and they cared for it in a way that we do not. It was the beauty that stirred them. Well, in the Bible, it's moral order, much more important than aesthetics. When the Bible uses the word beauty, as I said, a woman anoints Jesus the night before his arrest, and he says, she's done a beautiful thing for me. He's not describing she looks like Marilyn Monroe. He's saying she did something beautiful from her heart. That's what the Bible means, because as God said in the Hebrew scriptures to Samuel when he was looking for a king, the Lord does not see as man sees. Do not look upon his handsome face or his tall stature. Look upon his heart. The Lord looketh upon the heart. That can be pretty terrifying if you're feeling your heart isn't quite where it should be. But that's the kind of beauty God is concerned with, obviously. And that's moral beauty, beauty of character. And that's what the whole Bible's teaching. So we have all these possibilities. But he says, let there be light, and the light is good, and there's a moral goodness to every day. And God divided the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness was night. And that's what was done on first day. Separation, distinction, order. Darkness from light, day from night. Order is beginning to emerge out of the tohu vavohu, the waste and void, out of which all this came. So God didn't create something out of nothing, if this is correct, but order out of chaos. Day 2, what do we have? We have this vault, which a rakia in Hebrew. And he translated it vault. And it's translated sometimes firmament, whatever that means. And firm, a space for life to dwell. That's how I'd understand it and picture this vault of the heavens. And here is our place, an empty place waiting for all the creations to come. And so you have this vault-like thing, which he calls the heavens. And he divides other things. Let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide water from water. And God made the vault and divided the waters beneath the vault from the waters above. What's this talking about? It's talking about the fact that rain came from up there. And yet you knew you had seas all around you and rivers. So there's water beneath the earth and there's water above the heavens. And at certain times, that water above the heavens is going to fall. But we are in this rakia, in this space that God opened up between water here and water here. It's a rather fragile space, but God made it for us to dwell in. And the creation is going to take place between the waters above and the waters beneath. And when Noah's flood comes, it's not just a lot of rain, folks. It's the water above that God put there at the creation and the water beneath that he put there at creation that come crashing together. The uncreation of the world, the return to chaos. But 40 days and 40 nights, Noah gets through it, and order is affirmed over chaos, as it always is in every myth, which is the point of the myth. All right. So day 2, you have this vault in which history will take place. But remember, the water is still up there and down there, and like Tiamat could come back to bite us, and periodically does. Day 3, and God said, let the waters of the heavens be gathered. So you have seas and dry land appear, more order. And he calls the dry land earth. This is not a bad place. It's a good place. In the Hebrew understanding of things, the word world is never used in a negative sense. The world, the flesh, and the devil. The world isn't bad. He's going to say in a minute, it's very good. The earth is good. This is our home. Don't screw it up. What does the poet say? Where every aspect pleases and only man is vile. Everything's perfect in this story. People aren't going to screw up until the next story. So far, everything's great. We have seas, we have dry land. He calls it earth. And what comes forth out of the earth on the 3rd day? But grass, plants, things yielding seed of each kind, trees bearing fruit of each kind. And so it was. And the earth put forth all these trees and plants. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening and it was morning, 3rd day. All right, so now we have dry land, we have seas, and we have trees and plants and all of this beautiful flora. 3rd day. 4th day. And God said, let there be lights. Well, wasn't there light already? Yes, there was a divine light. The rabbis call it the light of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. When he said, let there be light, he didn't mean the sun. There was no sun. He meant the light of his countenance, just the divine light that fills the world in the sense of the presence of God being there. Now we're going to get the sun and the moon, which the ancients believed were both sources of light. But notice that there's light before the sun, which means the direct light of God. He doesn't need what we call nature. There is no nature. Nature is what's there naturally. The world, according to the Bible, is creation, not nature. Nature and creation are 2 different interpretations of this green stuff we see out here. The word nature does not suggest anything beyond itself. It suggests laws within it. But the word creation, of course, immediately suggests a creator. And that's what the Bible story is about. So I would say the whole concept of nature as something sort of self-generated would be alien to the Bible. Everything is creation. The heavens declare the glory of God. And when you look at the sky, if you are religious of a certain kind, you might say, wow, God, that's a pretty good job. Nobody can paint the sky like you can, not even Monet. And it's all creation. It didn't have to be there. It's there for a reason, because it is good. So, long before the sun, we have that divine light. And finally, on the 4th day, he gets around to the sun. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to divide the day from the night. More order, not chaos. Day and night. And they should be signs for fixed times and days and years, all the seasons of the year. When it's cold, when it's warm, it's the sun and the moon have to do with that. And so it was. And God made the 2 great lights. The great light for dominion of the day, that's the sun, and the small light to have dominion over the night. The moon was the source of light, not just the reflection of the sun's light. But all right, that was their concept. And he made the stars also. the notion of what could they have meant by stars. Here we are in this season of Advent, and I heard Sunday night the wondrous tale of the wise men following a star from the east to the west that goes to Jerusalem, and then it moves to Bethlehem. What kind of understanding of stars could they have had? Divine lights that do what God wants them to do. If they believed in nature, they would say, oh, it's a hallucination. But if the world is creation, then God can do what he wants to do. When God told Abraham, you 100-year-old man and your wife at 90, you're going to have a child, Sarah laughs at God. And God said, why did your wife laugh? With God, all things are possible. Well, certainly that's what the writers of these texts believed. So everything's in God's hand. A star can zigzag around. Our concept of what a star is, a distant sun, nothing would ever to do. Theirs is an earth-centric idea. And so they tell tales that ancient people could perhaps take literally and wonder at. But modern people, we have to try to figure out what is the meaning of this, even if we aren't able to take it literally. All right, I mean, even every miracle needs a meaning, or else God wouldn't make it happen. And of course, we have to define what miracle is. So we've got the sun and the moon, and the light is divided. You have light and dark. And what else does he do on that day? Well, that keeps him busy. The light and the darkness, the order in the earth. So having started with the divine light, he then creates the sun, meaning this is a little polemic against nature. He doesn't need the sun to produce light. There was light before, but he just puts the sun here to maybe to make it a little more comprehensible to us what's going on, what the real source of light is God. So in nature, the great source of life would be the sun. But here's a story of how a God created the sun. And it's the God that we are to worship, not the sun that he created. So this was something new, that the God was an immaterial spiritual being of some kind. Nothing you could touch or see, unless he allowed you to see it by a beatific vision. Usually, this spiritual unseen power is given credit for everything. And the other ancients said, what are you talking about? These Jews are atheists. You know, the Jews were expelled from Rome because the emperor said, they're atheists. You go into their temple and synagogue, they don't have any statues of God. So they don't work. So therefore, even the great Romans, who created so much, could not understand an immaterial God. And this was a great step forward, we would think, in the Hebrew scriptures, and the tremendous difference in Western civilization. The kinds of things we think are ultimate. Are they physical or spiritual? All right, I'd say we should break at this point. We've got ourselves through the 4 days, and we'll talk about the 5th and then the most important 6th day, the creation of human beings. And if you feel, now this story goes on through, it's chapter 2, verse 4. That's the end of this 6-day story. It ends with the Sabbath, the 7th day in which God rests. Look how human God is for us. He has to rest. And then in the 5th verse of chapter 2, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heaven, we have the beginning of the next story. And if you want, over the next 2 weeks, since we have a break next week, read the Adam and Eve story in chapter 2 and think about how it differs from the first story. So if I ask in 2 weeks, what do you think about that? These are two different, why do we think they're written by two different authors? Where are the attitudes so very different? And they are. but you've got to read it carefully to figure out where. Meanwhile, have a wonderful Advent and Hanukkah and Christmas, a blessed holy season in which you try to hear the angels sing in a special way. That our two holidays come together, and both of them both are celebrated by kindling light, should tell us something about their origins and how we understand our job here as kindling light in a metaphorical and spiritual sense. So happy holidays to all, and we will meet here on the 2nd of January. Don't get so drunk on January. Over lasts for 2 days. I hope cover by the 2nd. See you
Happy
all.
Hanukkah, Mike.
Happy Hanukkah, Mike. Thank you.
Holiday blessings to all.